Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 12 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book discussing the history of political theory from the ancient Greeks to the modern day. And this time we are continuing through our discussion of the 15th and 16th centuries with Machiavelli. This is actually the last chapter in his part one of this book, I guess you could say. He kind of splits it into the modern world and then everything before the modern world. So from the next episode on, we'll be discussing what Alan Ryan considers to be the modern world in political thought. But this is here kind of in the Renaissance, where we're looking at Machiavelli in the pre-modern world for the last time. What do you think about this chapter?
Yeah. Well, I think it's described as book one and book two. So I don't know if these were originally two volumes. But so what did I think of Machiavelli?
Yes.
Is that what you asked me?
Yes, that's what I asked.
Pretty sharp cat.
Hmm.
I think he speaks a lot of truth.
I agree.
I share his views about. I have a cynical view of all politicians above a certain level of notoriety, or I guess a certain station. I guess anybody who is above has enough voters to make up a congressional district. Everyone that fills that role, because you can be a governor and have that's not a federal position, but you can have a lot of people underneath you. Everybody that has a political entity that elects them to office that's at least as big as a congressional district are all corrupt, 100% corrupt. And there's just varying degrees. It's like everything, like it's like all ice cream is ice cream. They just have different flavors, you know? And so I think they're just all corrupt, and there's just a level of corruption. And once you accept that, it frees you up to just try to vote in your best interest or the interest of the republic.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
having to worry about any of that stuff. Which
True.
frees you up to vote for somebody like Trump, or in the alternative, it frees you up to vote for somebody who's more corrupt, like Biden. Like, look at it, or Hillary Clinton or whatever. So I think Machiavelli just had a very kind of cynical, just very like I don't know if you say no nonsense view, just a view of, okay, how do you get and keep power?
True.
There's a lot. So I enjoyed the summary of it.
Yes.
What do you
So I mean, I agree. I mean, we'll get into it in a little bit, but of course, Machiavelli's very criticized for being like, a lot of people called him evil at times, with this whole ends justifies the means sort of deal. But it's like, I think it's a very realistic look at politics. I don't think he's ever saying this is how politics should be. He's just saying that this is how it is. If you want to achieve, success, you just have to do those things, and there's no alternative.
Oh, I don't know. I think well, of course, I haven't read him directly or a
Mhm.
translation of his, the Prince and the discourses. So, but I think from the summaries I have read, he may. I don't know that he would disagree that it's the way it should be. I don't know, but he would. I don't think he's saying this is a moral philosophy, or that that's the overriding theme of this type of writing or this type of analysis. It's not a religious text,
Yeah.
for sure. And so I don't know that he's saying necessarily that's not the way it should be, or the way it shouldn't be. I think it's just like, this is just the way it is. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think
I don't
that's
know
what
how
I
to.
was kind of getting at.
No, but I think you're I thought you went a little bit further, that he was saying this is not what the way it should be. This is just the way it is.
I mean, I didn't say that. I'm just saying saying he's not saying that, essentially. Like, I don't know how many double negatives I have to get into there, but he's not making a statement on how it should be or how it shouldn't be. He's just describing how it is.
Then we are in agreement.
Yes. Okay. Then let's get into Machiavelli, who he was himself. He was born in 1469 and died in 1527. His father was a notary, and so he received a humanist education. Machiavelli became the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic in 1498, and a month later was appointed Secretary of the Ten of War, the committee that supervised foreign relations and military preparedness.
Hey,
So,
I need to interrupt you.
yes,
Did you know that you are the son of a notary, and that
I
I am a son of a notary? So we are two generations of notaries.
that
But
is
mine has expired.
that is very sad. That is absolutely fantastic. Fun fact. Thank
You
you.
know how hard it is to be a notary now. All you
Is
have to
it?
do is you have to complete a test, which I think is 10 questions, and they provide the answers
Hmm.
online. And then you have to be bonded, which means like you have to have I think it's a $10,000 insurance policy. So you have to pay somebody about $100,
Hmm.
and then you have to buy the notary stamp and a book, and you are a notary.
Wow. Sounds like a hard job.
It's very, very easy, and you just have to get the notary certification from the local county county clerk
Hmm.
in whatever
Interesting.
county you reside. And you can
Interesting.
be a notary in Missouri. So all you people out there wondering, I really wanted to be. When I grew up, I want to be a notary. That's what you got to do.
I'm sure there's millions of people out there who are just dying to be notaries.
People probably, I think most people think it's some sort of big deal, but
Really
it's really a nothing. But go ahead.
interesting. Well, thank you for that fun fact. Because Machiavelli had this position as the Secretary of the Ten of War, he was frequently on diplomatic missions to the papal court, Louis X, and Emperor Maximilian. And he helped bring the war against Pisa to a conclusion with a militia recruited from the Contado, or the countryside around Florence. He was not a great figure in Florence, but he was well known and took pleasure in his job, becoming friends with many in upper class circles. This came to an end in 1512 when Florence surrendered to Ferdinand, King of Spain, and the Medici family were installed as de facto hereditary dukes, and Machiavelli was immediately dismissed from his position. A plot to assassinate the rulers was discovered, and Machiavelli's name was written on a piece of paper by a conspirator, and so he was tortured and jailed on the belief that he was part of the conspiracy, but was released a few weeks later because he was clearly innocent. For the rest of his life, he lived on a farm in Percusina, 7 miles from the city, with his wife and 6 children, but always wanted to return to politics. His attempts to find employment with the Medici family didn't work, but he secured writing commissions. But only his treatise on the militia was published within his lifetime. The Prince, his most famous work, was written in the last 6 months of 1513, but only published in 1532, was the first work to be placed on the Index of Prohibited Books. He also thought writing was second best to being active in politics. I'll read a short section from the book here. It says, "For 4 hours I experience no boredom, I forget all my troubles and my fear of poverty, and death holds no more terrors for me." Makes a great difference to what he wrote and how we should read it that Machiavelli was writing practically oriented books. They had to appeal to the dedicatee. The Prince was a failed job application, but they bore on one crucial question: how Florence and any similar city-states should be governed. Machiavelli's answer was that everything depended on the circumstances. If it were possible to reinstate the Roman Republic, it should be done. If, as seems probable, it is not, we can only hope that a true master of the skills that enable a man to gain power and keep it will arise and establish order. So that is generally, the theme that runs through all of his writing. He was a good writer and he wrote quite a bit, but he did not really prefer writing. He would have preferred to be active in politics and such. His writing was very practically oriented, very much used to address a very specific problem.
Yeah, and I like this little description of him when he was, I guess, living in that farm or with the kids and all that. And he's been retired, not voluntarily, but retired to the countryside by force, essentially. And he would get in his dress in his state robes and retire to his study to commune with the immortal dead. As he wrote his the Prince and the discourses, which are he emphasizes historical figures and what we can learn from them, and so he's communing with those dead people as he's writing these, these I don't know what you call them, books, I guess.
Books, essays, maybe?
Yeah, and so I think that's what I'm going to start doing. I'm going to start getting some stately robes and go into my basement.
Dress up like, Caesar and wear a big laurel crown and sit in the basement and write.
I was just thinking about a laurel. That'd be pretty cool. I need to get a laurel. That's a good Christmas present. So get me a fake gold laurel.
I don't think I'm going to get you a fake gold. I don't think that's going to happen.
Maybe like either a red robe with like a gold fringe or something. And
well, it'd have to be purple if you're going for like a Roman look.
No, that's true. Purple, but can I have gold trim on that or not? Or
I guess you could. I mean, if you're the emperor, I think you can just make the rules up.
All right, so that's what I want for Christmas: a purple robe with a gold trim and a fake gold laurel, and then I can go to my basement and commune with the immortal dead and write something brilliant before I die.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that suggestion. I'll get right on that.
Your mother's been bothering me about Christmas presents, because
Mm.
well, she's late this year. Usually she's bothering us around August.
Yeah,
I got
I haven't heard anything. I was
well,
surprised.
you're gonna be coming into town next weekend, so you're gonna get it.
That is true. That is true. I've
Very
been
good.
expecting it. I have no response for her yet, but I guess I'll have to think of something.
Well, you know what you do? You ask her for a purple robe with gold trim, and then when you open it up, you just give it to me, hand it over to me.
I don't think we're the same size. I'm going to be honest with you.
Uh, I think it's universal. Isn't it like a universal robe? Are robes universal? I guess they are. I guess they do have different sizes.
I mean, they'd have to have different sizes.
I would think they'd have men's size, men or kids. Do you think
Mm.
they really come with like significantly different size robes?
I mean, there had to have been very large people in ancient Rome.
I'm talking about now. Like you go to the store and you get a robe. It's either like men's or women's, isn't it?
I
Maybe it's
guess.
not.
I don't know. I feel
I've
like
never.
they still have small, medium, and large.
I have not
I don't know. Are
bought
you
a
talking
robe.
about like bathrobe or are you talking about like toga?
I'm not wearing a toga.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was envisioning actual like Roman toga.
Hmm. Okay. All right. You can.
All right.
Anyway, Machiavelli. It's kind of a sad uh, thought of this brilliant guy, brilliant writer who's now we're talking about him and reading about him. Everybody's anybody who studies politics has to study him, and he seems like it's kind of sad.
Mhm.
He had this career and he was I think he took they said in here took pride in doing the impossible. Representing his government or the leaders and did a very good job and really did a good enough job that when the power turned from one faction to another, then he's out on his butt, and then he's just stuck on his farm writing books. And it's
Mhm.
kind of sad, that who knows? He could have been a great man. I
Mhm.
mean, I guess he is a great man of history, meaning that very influential because of his writings. But who
Mhm.
knows what he could have accomplished otherwise?
That is true. That's a good point. It's interesting to
Feel
think
bad
about.
for him. And then
Yeah.
he's on a list of banned books.
Yeah.
Of course, he's got good company from the Roman Catholic Church. It's like, hey, if anybody says anything true, anything accurate about the papacy, they're on the list. So there it goes. He's on the list.
That's actually a good segue to the unplaceability of Machiavelli. He's an interesting figure because he had a large impact on European politics, but Machiavellian now has negative connotations. If you refer to something in that way, it's like, well, that's kind of an evil or very, ends justifies the means sort of deal. The popular image of Machiavelli as the teacher of evil, who prays deceit and violence, is not the whole truth. He actually took pains to insist that political success demands morally obnoxious acts from anyone seriously engaged in politics. So it is true that he says, you kind of have to separate your morals from your success if you do want to succeed in politics. But Alan Ryan says that there was a very common sense and everyday political practice in Renaissance Italy, suggested that virtue and effectiveness were at odds here and now. Rulers are moved by reason of state, i.e., keeping the show on the road. So Machiavelli was ready to say that political success demanded an unflinching willingness to violate every moral precept appropriate to private life. So it's kind of just a given. He's looking around at how politics actually functions. He's like, well, common sense says you cannot really be a moral person. And so
What are
this,
your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on whether he's right about that?
I mean, I think it's true. I mean, I think if you really want to have success, especially, in the system we have today too, I mean, it's in some ways very similar to the Medici family in Florence, I think, if we want to get into that a little bit later. But it's true. It's like you can't really have much success if you're not very rich and you have a lot of donors. And at that point, you kind of have to listen to, what this donor says or what that donor says. You have to make some deals. And I don't think you'll be a very moral person by the end of it.
All right, so that begs the question: are you even do you have any interest in being involved in politics in the future? And if so, why on earth would you sell your soul in that manner?
That's a good question. I would only, I don't know. I don't really know. I haven't really given it too much thought. Um,
Well,
I
you
feel
have to
like,
give. I'm gonna make you give that thought as you get older, because if you start talking about running for office, we're gonna have this conversation again about Machiavelli
mm,
and the corruption of politics, because I'm a low level failed politician in the local county level, And it was an eye-opening experience when I first ran for county office. I ran for school board one, and that was local enough where people just knew who you were,
Hmm.
or they didn't know and then you get too much beyond that if you're out there politicking and having to raise money and having to communicate with people who will never meet you,
Hmm.
then you get to a different level, and there's more of a risk of compromise.
Yeah.
Then beyond that, it's a compromises all the way down, and
Yeah. I don't think I'd ever run if I didn't think I could do it honestly. If I think I could win honestly, like without, compromising my morals, I think I would. But then that's the question of, what position could I even get honestly? It would have to be a small position.
didn't you just acknowledge that in the American political system, in order to be successful, you have to
Yes.
compromise your morals? Didn't you
I, d-
just say
I
that?
did say that. I did say that. So I think there would have to be some
I guess you're the
significant
you're the
change.
exception.
I am
You're
the
the
exception.
exception.
I am the one exception.
You're so virtuous that you
Mhm.
can overcome everything.
And I did not say that. I did not
Like,
mean that. I mean, there would have to be a lot of change to the system before I think I would have a chance at running because I wouldn't want to run a dishonest campaign. I wouldn't want to run a campaign that would have me, sacrifice my morals in some way.
no, then you can lose elections like I did.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. Oh, man. But I mean, I think that's my answer. I don't think, with the current state of things, I think the answer is no.
The current state of things is the same as the current state of things that has always been, isn't it?
That is
How is it
true.
different now? I mean, I guess 30, 40 years ago, maybe it was different. But, when the country is young, maybe it was different. But even then, it was rough and tumble.
Yeah.
I mean, they were defaming people. I mean, they all sorts of like editorial cartoons that make people look like they're apes or
Mhm.
monsters or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, back in Machiavelli, it was tough times.
That is
At
true.
least now you don't get murdered. Back then it was even tougher.
That is true. That is true.
Mm. All right. Well, good talking on that because I'm going
Yeah.
to remind you of this conversation if you're, hey, Dad, I think I'm going to run for office. You stupid.
Back to Machiavelli, he did leave the tension between morality and success unresolved. Machiavelli suffers if taken out of context, according to Alan Ryan. You can't really say, well, he says this here, that means, he justifies every bad thing to ever happen. Not necessarily. He's looking at it very practically. He also says the Prince and the discourses on living were written to help the author realize his ambition to play a role in Florentine politics, and they are very specifically relevant to the Medici as well. And the question of whether a state that has once been corrupted can regain its liberty preoccupies both works. And Florence itself is necessary for context. That's kind of what we get into next. But I think that question is exactly what we were just talking about. Whether a state that has been corrupted can regain its liberty. Can we ever, change the system in such a way to make it a better system at this point, or is it always going to be corrupt from here on out until the United States, crumbles into dust? I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I've just become very, very cynical about the whole thing, and it's but then but today I'm just feeling cynical. So
Mhm.
the other days I'm optimistic about our republic, and that that the voters will generally get it right. But it's hard to believe that in the last 10 years. It's tough to think that that's a real possibility, or that the voters are getting it right, or the system is working. We're going to skip ahead to something he talks about. I guess I'll just allude to it, and then we'll move on.
Mhm.
But I think part of I used to think, and I still think, that one of the problems with our republic now is how we select senators. I think that's a part of it. There needs to be better local control, which I think means the legislature should pick the United States senators, which people think, well, that'd be more corruption, but actually you end up having more control over them. And I've talked about that podcast before. But I think part of it is our republic was so successful while we were expanding.
Mhm.
While we're adding states, while we're adding territory, while we're adding everything, we haven't added anything. The time that we stopped adding states, it seems to be very similar, very around the same era, that the republic starts having really, really big problems. And I think I'm starting to think that maybe we should just we are like he mentions that the republics need to keep expanding.
Hmm.
It's the growth, like the Roman Republic. It's almost like it has to keep growing, or else it collapses in on itself.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Interesting.
we can talk about that at the end. But I'm starting to think that maybe that's the cause, and we're just looking at all these different little symptoms. But without the growth, without the expansion, good or bad, I mean, there's some, obviously some bad aspects to our expansion west and all that stuff.
Hmm.
But if we don't have that type of struggle, that kind of unified purpose of a country that's not at war necessarily, I think we kind of lose our minds a little bit.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, we'll get back to that. I'll keep
Yeah.
thinking about that. But we move on to a discussion of Florence itself, how it was structured at this time, because this is very much crucial for Machiavelli's discussions here. Florence was constitutionally a popular republic, but for most of the past century, while Machiavelli was there, it had been ruled de facto by the Medici family. It was a regional power and had a large emphasis on liberty for its citizens, but this was not reflected in its treatment of subordinate cities that it controlled. So it was very powerful in central Italy and kind of had some vassal cities that it had control over. In ideology, liberty was vital, but in practice, so long as the Medici family did not claim to rule by hereditary right and were good managers, they were accepted as rulers. So it's kind of just a given at the time that the Medici were in charge. They didn't really want to do anything because they were doing a good enough job of running everything. Many Republicans believed that so long as one family rule did not empty the state treasury or murder rivals without recourse by law, it was not truly tyranny. So they're kind of justifying at this time, why we have this group of people running things. During periods of stress, discussion turned to classical thinking about Republican institutions. Florence was the center of Renaissance intellectual life, and it was thought to produce intelligent and organized thought about politics. And it was one of the dominant powers in northern and central Italy, and it was a great trading site, and it was the first banking center in Europe. Alan Ryan says here, its prominence now made Florence vulnerable, too powerful to be ignored, and too weak to act as it chose. So it's really in this really unfortunate middle area where it's got so much power that it's, very prominent, but not enough power that it can do anything at once. It's kind of trapped between the papal states and other powers in Europe at this time who all have their eyes on it at this time. The Florence Constitution was a classical city-state constitution instituted in 1293 to ensure neither the nobility nor the urban poor could hold unchecked power. The city was ruled by the Signoria, a committee of 8 priors chaired by the Confadiere of Justice. This met with 2 other committees, the Committee of 12 Good Men and the Committee of the 16 Gonfalonieri of the city's 16 districts. Legislation was considered by the 300-member Council of the People and the 200-member Council of the Commons, who were chose by the Signoria. And they rotated membership every 2 to 6 months, and the main committees were selected by lot, by names drawn out of a bag, and it was common for names to be disqualified, which gave a lot of power to the scrutinizing committee that decided who was eligible. But such a complex and slow-moving system was doomed to be overturned or subverted, but for a long time it was not publicly subverted. In the 60 years before the Republic of 1494, the Medici family did not hold prominent public office, but nobody doubted that they ruled Florence. And the way this came to be, that in 1433, Cassino de' Medici narrowly escaped death at the hands of the rival Albizzi family, which instantly alienated their supporters, and Cosimo returned in triumph in 1434. And then an emergency council was assembled to reinstate him and remove his opponents, but he brought enough armed men to this meeting to send a message to the assembled citizens, so kind of saying, you better vote for me, or else I have my whole army here. This is for my own safety, but really it's to let you know what you should do here. He says here, the Medici governed Florence within republican forms by controlling the personnel of government and ensuring that their friends were in control. The family suffered from hereditary uricemia, the disease underlying gout, and were short-lived, so their rule was never wholly secure. Because they died young, they inherited power young, and the success of any particular Medici ruler depended on temperament and innate capacity more than experience. Then from 1494 to 1498, the government was in the hands of the partisans of Girolamo Savonarola, and his campaign against the ecclesiastical corruption drew the hostility of the papacy. Papal presence and civil discontent resulted in his removal from office, and the reconstituted republic was established in 1498. The chief novelty at this time was the creation of the Grand Council, which attempted to keep a tight rein on the grandi or nobili, the upper classes, but the body became too large to be effective at all. Then 15 years after the fall of the Republic to King Ferdinand that we talked about earlier, Rome was sacked by mutinous imperial armies, and this humiliation of the Medici Pope Clement VII prompted the expulsion of the Medici family, in the summer of 1527, which restored the Republic for 3 years until the Medici family was restored and Florence became a Grand Duchy when there was actually hereditary rule instated at that time. So very complex history, really all about this one family that kind of, controlled things in the shadows through this sort of political coup, and then very much controlled it publicly after they kind of reinstated it as a Grand Duchy. So an interesting history there with Florence. What are your thoughts on Florence? Any thoughts on the city of Florence?
Well, it probably, I mean, that kind of troubled history going back and forth and having all these different factions involved and probably influenced his writing and his beliefs.
Oh, absolutely.
How he viewed what a ruler needed to do in
Mhm.
order to get and retain power, because it's just, it's always at risk of somebody tricking you or betraying you and or betraying your people, and then you're in big trouble.
True.
Like that one guy who got executed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's I know he says in here, it's not really that dissimilar from, how modern politicians, we do have family politicians nowadays. We do have, families who have been in political power for decades at this point. It's like, well, is it really that different from the Medici family? Like, sure, they were elected and sure they have checks on them, but I mean, the Medici family technically were elected in some places and, controlled things behind the scenes in others. But it's like, it is still the case today that we do have, popular political families controlling a lot of legislatures.
Yeah, and we had it even in the early days of the Republic. You had John Adams and you had John Quincy Adams. More modern, you have George Bush and George W. Bush,
Mhm.
and you know diluting of talent from the beginning to the end. But yeah, I mean it's kind of funny because it's natural. If you have a parent that's involved in politics, you're more likely to have an interest in it. Just like if your dad's a doctor, you're more likely to see that as a realistic possibility. You're going to know how do you what the job is and how to get there, and and then also politicians can really help their kids.
Mhm.
If they're really interested in having their kids be successful politicians, they've been through the ringer, and so then they already have all these friends and supporters, and they
Mhm.
kind of they can encourage their friends to support their kids. And in a more less corrupt kind of example, the other people that are involved in politics had an opportunity to see the kid grow up and in theory know that that person is of good character and can
Mhm.
do the job. So it's like you do have a leg up, maybe even legitimately, because if you're a good person, an effective person, they know you already. The people in power already know you, and you've already made the personal connections with them, and so then it's just a matter of capitalizing on that. So I think it's kind of natural, and even in a republic or a democracy where people are elected, just from those very practical considerations, are more likely to be involved in it. Now, having said all that, it really is a horrible idea to have multi-generational people involved in politics in a republic. I mean, look at the Kennedy clan. I
Mhm.
mean, um, Joe Kennedy, who was the patriarch of it, was a terrible person by all accounts.
Mhm.
And Teddy Kennedy, a drunk, killed that girl in a drunk driving accident, which everybody forgets about. Just
Yeah.
a horrible person, that able to retain power through those kind of family connections.
Mhm.
His brother was president, who was assassinated. His other brother was assassinated as well, and they got these affiliated Kennedys all over the place. That
Yeah.
finally, I don't think there's a single one in office now.
Mhm. Well, I know
But
that.
I think Trump finally beat all the Bushes, so
Yeah.
he did that for us.
Well, it was the Bushes and the Clintons and the Cheneys as well, I think. I
Right,
don't think there's any of them in office, and they've been, there's been at least one Cheney or one Clinton in office for many decades at this point.
right. Well, I mean, it was Dick and Liz. It
Yeah.
was really just two of them.
Mm.
And Trump also got rid of Liz Cheney, so that did us all a favor doing that too. But I mean, maybe Barron Trump will be in the White House in 10 years, 15
I
years. I
don't
don't know how
know.
long it is, but he has the name, or
Mhm.
maybe he's of course he's one son. I mean, he got Trump Jr. We got
Yeah, I was about to say I'm surprised Don Jr. hasn't run for anything at this point. I'm very surprised actually.
right, right.
But
So just a matter of time.
Yep, that is true. That is true. Moving on to the Prince itself. What is actually in the Prince? What is he saying in the Prince? Machiavelli wrote the Prince following the failure of the Republic. The topic is how a new prince is to take and maintain power. He says the staying power of the book comes from the sweeping statements about human nature, the role of fortuna or chance in public life or in political life, and insistence on the need for a clear-sighted appreciation of how men really are as distinct from moralizing talk of how they ought to be. So that's really what makes it unique. It's really about human nature, about, how men are, what's the role of chance, those big topics, and less about, what is he actually saying here, although it is interesting the actual steps that he says a prince should take. And the book divides into two.
It's a lot different than other previous books or writings on advice to a prince, because there or to an aspiring ruler, or the utopian thought, because the Machiavelli, like you said, I'm kind of restating what you said, but in a different way. The the purpose of it is not to argue, okay, this is what you should do, or this is the best way to do it. This ought to have the perfect republic, or the best government, or the best ruler. It's just about getting there and getting it done. And like you said, it's just practical, has nothing to do with ideals, and it's not utopian. And so it kind of speaks to me in that sense, because it's more of a realistic or practical advice rather than what they should do. It's just what they have to do.
Yeah, very true. Very true. He goes on to say that it divides into two parts. The first 11 chapters consider different sorts of principalities and the way to acquire and hold them, and then 14 of the remaining 15 form a parodic mirror of princes, covering a variety of topics like military prowess, honesty, mercy, generosity, and avoidance of contempt and hatred. It also ends with an exhortation to the Medici princes to unify Italy and evict the foreign forces who had rampaged through Italy since 1494. So a call to action there in the end. The prince begins by telling Lorenzo de' Medici that Machiavelli has reflected on his own experiences and ancient history to provide genuinely new advice. And he says that, this is kind of a unique thing. This is one author who we're saying is, this is genuinely new. We're looking at the past and seeing how we can apply it today to create something wholly new and never said before. And he first separates hereditary states from those that are not, states that are completely new to a family from those annexed to a state that has long been ruled by the same family, states that were formerly republics from those that were principalities, and those acquired with the armies of others versus one's own. So he's kind of separating out, these different types of states and different ways to control them. He says hereditary principalities present no challenge to the prince. The crucial discussion lies in the way to keep control of mixed principalities, states that the prince has conquered with the aim of annexations. How do you make something that is foreign to you become, amicable to you and remain within your power? It says an annexed state will be hard to hold if its people are culturally very different from the conqueror state. However, it's not impossible. The Romans did this well, for example. It is not hard to acquire a state because humans are quick to be discontented and blame their current rulers and kick them out. But having done so, they will find their new rulers likely worse, so the costs of conquest fall heavily on the conquered population, prompting further rebellion. So it's very easy to kick the old rulers out, but then once you get a new ruler in, they're just as easily kicked out, if not easier kicked out. And so the real question he's looking at is, how do we keep these new rulers in power? What do they have to do in these situations?
That's right. And it's kind of funny how he describes like hereditary rulers. When they come into power, they inherit it from their usually, in this case, the fathers. And I like the description that that long habits of obedience give the incumbents an advantage over any rivals, because the people are already used to being ruled by this family, and it's just, okay, well, we just have a new king, and you just have a celebration of this transfer. Everything else remains the same until the new king starts asserting himself differently than the previous king. But then it's just a different flavor, of that ruler. So it's kind of interesting how he describes it that way. And I don't know. I don't know if I agree with his description that it's easy or it's not hard to acquire a state. I guess if you have enough power, I guess that's what he's saying. If you have sufficient power to do it, it's easier to conquer them than to keep them subjugated, I guess, or keep them as a client state or whatever. And then he goes on, which I'm sure we're going to go to next, and
Yes.
exactly how do you do that, which is either you colonize them, I think, and that one option. The other one is just to
Mhm.
crush them, right?
Pretty much. Yeah, he says here the solution is first to ensure that there are no partisans of the deposed ruler to cause trouble. And then the second step is to go and live in the conquered territories. But by this, he does not mean that you literally live as king in the conquered country, but install an administration of your own to monitor and control. You set up colonies in that sort of fashion, and colonies mean settlements of soldiers who are rewarded with farms. He actually says here, in Machiavelli's words, wanting to annex territory is indeed very natural and normal, and when capable men undertake it, they are always praised, or at least not criticized. But if men who are not capable of achieving it are bent on undertaking it at all costs, this is a blunder that deserves censure. So he's saying, if you're going to try to do this, do it right. Make sure it works and make sure it sticks. Otherwise, you're going to be kicked right back out, and you're not going to be accomplished anything.
Yeah, and the colony thing is, it's not just like the European nations when he colonized the African or South American countries. Yeah, the Soviet Union did that with their states, the Soviet
Mhm,
states. That's why there's so many Russian minority populations in like the Baltic states or like Ukraine, because people were moved there
mhm,
forcibly or voluntarily, and so a lot of those people, then people were moved out, and sent to the gulag and et cetera, et cetera. So you see that in modern times too, and there's a certain amount of what I call it success, but there's a certain effectiveness in doing that and having the local population that speaks the not necessarily the local language, but it forces everybody to have, it creates a lot of problems
mhm,
to try to administer that conquered state once you have a local politician of the conquering country in there,
mhm,
even if there's a lot of differences, different language and everything. So there's a lot of truth to what he's saying.
mhm. He goes on to say exactly what you were just saying, that men should be either caressed or crushed. They can avenge slight injuries, but not severe ones. So if you hurt them a little bit, they'll strike back. But if you hurt them a lot, they can't physically strike back. And along with that, he observes the difference between Alexander the Great easily conquering Persia, as the inhabitants were used to being governed in centralized states, and the difference between that and the Roman experience in Gaul, where independent tribes had been used to liberty. And so they rose up against the Romans because they were not used to this one man centralized rule in a way. This is not what we want. We're going to kick you out of Gaul.
Right. And that was a mistake, like the Germans when they invaded the Soviet Union in
Hmm.
World War II. In some areas, they were greeted as liberators, which people forget because how bad Stalin and his predecessors were. But the Nazis were just such murderous bastards, and they killed too indiscriminately. I'm not saying that they should kill any, but I'm saying, I mean, as far as being an effective conqueror, they caused the local population to turn against them and then the entire nation was partisan against them when they had an opportunity to do something different, but they, of course, they couldn't. They had to be who they were,
Hmm.
and bad things follow.
That is true. He says that long traditions of genuine self government pose problems for the new prince. So, what he should do is either utterly destroy the old institutions or leave as much as possible intact so as to govern with the least irritation to the old sentiments. He draws these morals from the Spartans and Greeks. Says either show a respect for the conquered institutions by governing behind the shield that they provide and veil your authority, or stomp on opposition and exile or kill the previous elite and make it clear that those who are not for you are as good as dead. So either, maintain whatever institutions they have and rule through them, or completely demolish them and install your own.
The left is doing the former through all our institutions in our country. So they've taken over the universities. They didn't conquer them. They got inside them, and then they destroyed them from within, and then they wear the skin of the university as like a costume for their bizarre theories and for their totalitarian impulses, and so then once you have the educational system, et cetera, you can go down the line of what else you can take over. But they're doing that with all our institutions. They've done that with the FBI now. FBI used to be more right wing than other governmental agencies. Now it's completely left wing and anti Republican Party, anti conservative, and because they took over those institutions. So Machiavelli is giving them good advice on how to get this done, because if you take over those existing institutions and you use them to to assert control over a population, it's very, very effective.
Mm-hmm.
Because the alternative is to crush them, but you have to make sure that if you're going to crush them, it's very dangerous, because you really have to crush their spirit, because if there's hope, or of being able to fight back, you're going to have a whole bunch of partisans, which is not what you want when you're conquering another country or another kingdom or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And because you go overboard, then they got nothing to lose. That's why he's talking
Yeah.
about caressing them. It's like, you can take them over, but you have to make sure that you treat them in such a way that there's a certain amount of buy-in, or you just take over the institutions and you basically conquer them from within. Very effective, and I think he's a brilliant thinker on those subjects.
Mm-hmm. I agree. But he was fascinated by the contrast between those who were effective leaders and deserved congratulation, and those who were installed in power by others or by only good luck. A lot of that stems from the very superstitious Florence. A lot of them believed in divine intervention or luck being the prime factor in these things. He even says that the newly revived republic elected Christ as king in 1527 in the belief that prayer and self-mortification would attract divine behavior. So there's definitely a tradition of that in Florence.
I never heard that either. Had you ever heard that?
I'd never heard of that. It's interesting.
And I'm surprised it didn't work.
Yes. He goes on to say that those who rely on their own political capacity are less vulnerable to fortune turning against them or allies leaving them. And then he discusses various, leaders that he considers to be some of these great leaders. He includes Moses, Theseus, Cyrus, and Romulus among these great leaders dependent on their own political capacity. And he says that all armed prophets succeed, but unarmed ones fail. That if you have this idea, if you have this motivation, you have to be armed. If you're a very peaceful prophet, you're not going to really make much of an impact politically, is kind of what it comes down to here in Machiavellian terms.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to have the force to be able to back up your ideas. If you're going to conquer, if you're a secular, it's a secular, you can have a lot of influence as a prophet for your philosophical beliefs and in religious advocacy. But if you're really going to make a difference within the government and in public policy, you better have enough people in power, or powerful people, or an army to back that up. He's absolutely right, because if you don't, you're just a gadfly talking about what should happen, and you'll never be in power. You'll never be able to maintain power if by luck you happen to get into power.
True. He goes on to say that Machiavelli had a strong sense that humans are creatures of habit, which argued for taking things slowly. He says good habits need to be inculcated, and religion is an effective tool in this. He says habits of obedience should be instilled by a mixture of fear and favor, backed by whatever moral and spiritual resources come to hand. And he says the fact of obedience would soon turn into belief that one ought to obey. So if you come at things powerfully and you make people obey, eventually, through your means, if you use religion, if you use sort of this propaganda effort, I guess you could call it, people believe that it is morally good to obey in a way, not just that it is necessary for them to do so.
Well, it's kind of like Stockholm syndrome writ large,
Yeah.
because you figure, well, this is the way it is. Maybe this is the way it should be. And I do like at the very end of this little section here, he says, "It will do you no good if physical force is not on your side as well, even if you are a true prophet of God. You better have some physical force to back you up." But yeah, and those habits and those customs that he was talking about are very important. If you get people, once you get people used to being controlled, then you're 90% of the way there into making them do whatever you want them to do. And that's what a lot of this COVID nonsense was, to kind of get off topic. But once it was it was quite a shock to everybody to have the whole country shut down for 15 days. Never happened before in the history of the world. And once that was done, then it was like, okay, well, we already did that. So why are you complaining about this thing that's less than shutting the entire world down? Why are you complaining about, it's just a mask. It's just 6 foot separation. It's just a vaccine. It's just a shot, and on down the line. And once you get people used to, there were people, it was, and even for me, who only was minimally compliant with the mask stuff, when I would go into a store, and I would go into a store without a mask, You felt odd.
Mm-hmm.
When you first started, it was odd to have one on, but then after you were forced to do it for a while, it was odd to take it off. And
Yeah.
that's why you still see some people. I saw a few people. I don't see very often anymore in our neck of the woods. But I was at a library, a college library, and there were three people in there with masks, and I was just kind of taken aback. And I guess they just get so used to it, they don't want to give it up.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange to me, and they would
Well, I
have
think.
never worn a mask before COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
and now they're wearing a mask every day, and it's very interesting to me.
Well, I think it's that moralizing aspect, that the fact that you ought to, because it was this idea instilled in everybody that you are doing this because it's protecting other people. You are doing this because you if you do this, you will be a good person and you will be morally good in wearing a mask. Even after studies started coming out saying, hey, maybe mandatory masking everywhere was not the best solution and did not really stop the spread XYZ blah 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 blah. But I still see people up here on the college campus still wearing masks. I've seen more people wearing masks in recent weeks than at the beginning of the semester, actually. I
Yeah.
think because it's, cold and flu season coming up, and anytime anybody gets a cough, they're like, oh, I better wear a mask so people don't think I'm an evil, amoral person if I
Mm.
cough in class. I think is really the idea behind it, which is interesting.
It could be, could be. I think these people that are mask enders, they're going to wear masks for a long time. I think you're right. There's a piousness about it. It's like saying a rosary every day
Mm,
for them. They don't have religion anyway, so this is their religion. But I also think it's become a habit. And I think for people that are anxious to begin with, even if you're not, let's just say they're not anxious, even though they're all probably somewhat mentally disturbed. But the ones that are still wearing masks now, but even if they were normal before all this, I think it is a little anxious to take
mhm.
off that mask. If you really believed in doing it and you were doing it for so long, it's weird to go out without a mask on your face. It's kind of like old, like you see those old movies in the 1930s and 40s. Every guy wears a hat.
Mm,
That was the thing. You went out of the house, you're wearing a hat, like a nice hat, not a cap, you know, not a top hat, but like one of those. I don't know, so not really a fedora, but anyway, you know what I'm talking about. If you
yes,
see
I
those
know what
old
you're talking
black and white movies, every guy wears a hat,
about.
and I think after if you didn't go out wearing a hat, you'd feel funny because you
Yeah.
always wear a hat. And I think that's the same thing, and that kind of echoes what he's talking about. If you get people in a habit of following orders, even if they're small orders, and I think that's the way to do it, is you get them accustomed to, okay, this person's in charge and they're saying do this, and even if it's something that's really mundane and something you would have done anyway,
Mhm.
to get people to agree to do something just because you told them to do it, that's the first step. And you just kind of get into that, you get lulled into it. And that's why if anybody tells me I have to do something, my instant reaction is to not do it, even if I wanted to do it already. It's like, eat that candy. And they're like, no, I want to eat the candy. And I think and I used to think that the people in the United States were more like that. I thought that was more common, and it really is not anymore.
Yeah.
And I've really woken up to that, um, after COVID-19. And he's right. That's how you control a population, and it's
Absolutely.
really wild to see it in practice in this modern era. And
Mhm.
we're going to see more and more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting back to Machiavelli, though, after our rant on the subject of COVID,
That was
um,
directly related to Machiavelli.
that
That was
was, but it doesn't
directly
make it
tied
any
into.
less of a rant. It does not make it any less of a rant. It was still a rant.
That's not a rant. A rant is a monologue, an angry monologue, and
Mhm.
I have not done that this episode yet.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get to one. But we move on to the puzzle of Cesare Borgia. This was really an interesting figure that um, Machiavelli had to overcome here, because Cesare Borgia was the son of the future Borgia Pope Alexander VI. And he was made a cardinal in his teens, but when Alexander became pope, Cesare renounced his cardinalship and was appointed captain general of the papal armies. And so Alexander's intention was to unify the Italian states under his leadership, and Machiavelli deplored the fact that the papacy was too weak to unify Italy, but too powerful to allow any other state to do so. Since Alexander was pope for only 6 years and Cesare could not influence papal succession and was later killed in battle after imprisonment in Spain, And the question for Machiavelli was whether Caesari could have done more to secure his position. He says Caesari is presented as someone whose wickedness was directed intelligently and efficiently in making himself master of the Romagna, or sort of the center of power in Rome. So Machiavelli admires Borgia's plot to ensure the Orsini gave him no trouble, a very powerful family at the time. He feigned reconciliation with them and seized them at a conference and had them strangled over the next 4 weeks. So kind of that idea of, stamp out all opposition, and Cesare Borgia absolutely did that. And the Romagna was...
That's a bad way to go, too. I mean, I guess it's slightly better than drowning, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is not great, not a great way. He says the Romagna was part of the papal patrimony, but had fallen into the hands of small-time rulers. Alan Ryan says here, Borgia saw that any government that could keep the peace would be accepted if it provided justice according to law and avoided outright banditry. First step was to secure the peace. For this purpose, he installed Ramiro de Orco, to whom he gave full power to suppress dissent and restore order. His chosen agent was effective, but his methods aroused resentment. Borgia took 2 steps to ensure that the resentment did not reach back to himself. The first was to establish a regular court to which lawyers could take grievances. The second was to have Ramiro de Orca arrested, cut in 2 pieces, and placed in the main square at Cesena the day after Christmas, together with an executioner's block and a knife. This terrible spectacle left the people both satisfied and amazed. So, yeah, really evil, evil dude. That is a brutal series of events there. He makes this guy control everybody, and then because everybody was getting mad at this guy controlling everybody, he had him publicly executed, and then got everybody to love him, even though that was the guy he put in power in the first place. It's a crazy, crazy situation, but I guess apparently very effective.
Yeah, and very logical. I mean, if in the Ramiro de Orco, or however you say his name, probably deserved it too. If he's
Probably.
really crushing these people, he's probably killed a fair number of them, and it's actually oddly brilliant to have a guy go in there with a really heavy hand and then ultimately execute him and say, "Oh man, I didn't realize that he got so carried away." What a horrible person, and then have him publicly executed and dismembered, just to satisfy the local population. Then set up courts so they can air their grievances,
Mhm.
essentially, and give them their day in court. Brilliant. I mean,
Yeah.
it's horrible, but
Yeah.
and I wonder if he had decided before he installed the guy that's what he's going to do, or if he just made that call when the population kind of started to rise up. I suppose that it was the latter of the two. That
Mhm.
if the guy was successful and efficient and was able to suppress everybody, he would have probably lived a long and happy life, so to speak.
I mean, I guess it was probably a mix of both, if I had to guess. Like he knows, all right, this guy is going to restore the peace, and he's going to do it in a very heavy-handed way. And if that works, great. But I have this backup plan in case everybody hates this, because I feel like if you're in that position, you have to have a backup plan for everything. So if everybody turns against this guy and tries to put it on you, you've got to get rid of this guy, and he knew how to do it.
Yep, and Machiavelli certainly would agree with that,
Yeah.
having that backup plan.
Mm-hmm. He goes on to say that Machiavelli admired the papal states for their use of religious authority to maintain power, but he criticized their lack of actual governance of their subjects. So they had all this power and they had all this control, but they didn't really do anything with it. They just kind of had all these states and didn't really, control them in a way that was satisfactory to Machiavelli's tastes. The second part of The Prince then focuses on the virtue of the prince. And Machiavelli was kind of obsessed with military effectiveness combined with the ability to form clear policy. And that was really his really main feature that he was looking for in an effective prince. Are you a militarily effective, and can you make clear policy? But he says that the prince should not pay too much heed to his personal characteristics, save insofar as they lead him astray in matters of policy. And of course, that's a very big difference from previous thinkers that we've looked at, especially Cicero, who's looking at what are the virtues of the prince or the rulers, and what should they do? What should their personal characteristics be? Machiavelli does not care. He says you could be a terrible person, you can be a good person. Just make sure you're effective, and that's really, really what he's looking at here.
Right. I like this quote. Maybe you're going to use it, but where he says, "All men are by nature bad and will do all the evil they can." And so if you hold that view, that it justifies a lot of actions to maintain order and peace, because otherwise you're unleashing a whirlwind of violence and horribleness. And he's talking about virtue not as in a moral, like you said, not in a moral sense, but just in effectiveness. Like he kind of equates virtue with effectiveness.
Yeah, he uses the word virtu, not the word virtue, which I'm guessing is just the Italian word for virtue. But he defines it here as the ability or quality that makes for political success. He goes on to say that a whole people can display virtue, but a prince's virtue should be intrinsic in boldness, ambition, and readiness to get himself killed in his attempt to seize power. So really his clear mark of if you have this virtue is, are you just aggressive enough? Are you bold enough to go after this and get it? And that's what really is the one defining characteristic of what a prince should have, is this ambition. He also says that a prince cannot be wholly honest. He must know how to deceive his rivals and murder them. It also raises the question of whether it's worth it to be politically successful, because it kind of goes through and gives these examples of what you have to sacrifice and things like that. And he doesn't answer that question. Is it worth it to be politically successful if you have to do all of these terrible things?
Yeah, he doesn't care. I mean, that has nothing to do with what he's trying to explain. This is how you keep and maintain power. Period. If you want to learn how to be a great man, go say some prayers and read the Bible or something. I don't think he was even attempting to figure that out.
Agreed. He goes on to say that the reward for successfully constructing a republic is freedom. The citizen can live a civil life and enjoy their possessions and their liberties in peace. So that is the prince's reward in this. He does not really get this immediate satisfaction, but his people do.
Well, and I think it's mentioned. I don't know if it's in this section or maybe a little bit later, but the way Machiavelli describes it, I mean, the prince or the ruler has to be so all encompassing effort. It would be very tiresome and exhausting type of life where you're always trying to stay one step ahead of everybody else, and you have to know everything about what everybody else is doing or planning on doing in order to be able to respond or to preempt them. Aside from the moral side of it, we're okay. What are you sacrificing for your soul, but of your soul, when the general principles are honesty is not a requirement, and maybe dishonesty is probably a requirement, and that you have to be very violent in order to secure and maintain power. And so it's a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, he describes it as an economy of violence. He says the successful prince may get into power by unpleasant means, may maintain himself in power by unpleasant means, and may be a person whose moral character we do not care for. But he diminishes the amount of random, unpredictable, pointless violence and cruelty that we have to suffer. The prince's political reward is power. So it's like, we might hate this guy, we might hate everything that he's ever done, but at the end of the day, he might actually institute peace. He might not do it in a good way. We might, again, hate everything that he has ever done, but he has given us this peace in a way, and I guess we should be grateful in some respect for this breeds.
Yeah, I think that's his only real moral justification for all of this is that the ruler's going to sacrifice X, Y, and Z, but you're going to get the benefit of a stable population and, like you said, an economy of violence. So, meaning that a reduction in net death, net suffering, as if you can add it up on a table. And if that's true, I mean, there's a certain amount of logic to it, but it's really, it's an ends justifies the means, of course. When it all comes down to it, that's his entire philosophy in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of the justification to bomb Japan at the end of World War II. It's like, well, they're not surrendering. If we keep fighting this, we're going to end up with a lot more people dead. If we nuke these people, they'll get the message. It is essentially what I've always heard about sort of the decision to bomb Japan. Is like, in the end, it might have saved more lives rather than just throwing soldiers again and again and again at these beaches in Japan.
Yes, that's part of it. But there's a moral side of it too. I mean, they did initiate this war, and they were from beginning to end war criminals of the worst type. We all know about Hitler, but we ignore the rape of China, both before World War II and during it. The Japanese army were the most brutal and cruel of all the belligerents in World War II, and we warned them. The United States warned them of this, and we dropped a nuclear bomb on them, and they still didn't surrender. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, we nuked, literally nuked an entire city. Now the question is whether you needed to do a population center. That's a good question. But you know, and I don't know. It's really a question. It's a military target because their entire society was militarized, and they were manufacturing there. There's military base there and all that stuff. I don't think it's ever been a sole justification of a math equation of how many people would die.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one. I think it's a lesser part of it. I think it was just necessary
Mm-hmm.
because you were going to have death.
Yeah.
You were going to have a lot of death, a lot of Japanese deaths, and quite frankly, there would have been more Japanese killed if we did not drop the nuclear bomb, because we had really had a systematized firebombing campaign that was ready to go. So that at this point, and we're going off on a tangent, but at this point,
That's
Germany
right.
had been defeated.
Mm-hmm.
And so all those bombers or all those fighters were being transported over to the Japanese theater. And there were more people, I think there were more people that were killed in the fire bombings of Dresden, and I think there's another city, German city, that where they had, it was like hurricane force fire winds because they had so many incendiary bombs dropped on. I think Dresden was the maybe the worst, but we have to look it up. But that they sucked the air
Mm.
out of the entire area and just vaporized all these people through these
Wow.
individual bombs. They're incendiary bombs, and they carpet bombed it. So all those bombers that we had in the Japanese area theater, we're going to be joined by more than that number that we had in the German theater. And that's what would have happened. So the alternative would be drop two bombs on them, get them to surrender, or we're going to carpet bomb the entire Japanese island, and then we invade.
Yeah.
So that was going to happen before the invasion, and more people, I believe, many more non-combatants, more children, more women, elderly were going to be incinerated
Mm.
by the carpet bombing, fire bombing that was going to happen.
Yeah.
And they lost during the nuclear explosions, and then we would have invaded
Hmm.
if they hadn't surrendered, and then we would have had to murder all of them, and they would have murdered a lot of us. So I mean, I'm not a pacifist, and I'm not making. I don't think nuclear war is a great
Mhm.
thing, but it's not just. I don't think anybody uh, who knows about the situation is making an argument just upon numbers. Like
Yeah.
we're going to add up on this side of the ledger. We're going to okay, this we have one more dead body on the invasion side, so we're going to drop two nukes on them. No, I mean they were an entire society that was militarized, and the only thing they understood was force. Now you could argue, well, they would have surrendered conditionally,
Mm-hmm.
uh, kind of like the Iraq War, where there was kind of a surrender there. We had no fly zones and all that kind of stuff. Of course, or World War One was an armistice,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that really begot World War II because Germany surrendered when their army was in France.
Yeah.
The armies were not in Germany, and that was a big problem when the Allies knew that. They had to have an unconditional surrender and conquest and occupation of Japan, as well as Germany, just practically speaking.
Mhm.
And anyway, so that's a long aside, but
Yes.
I don't think there's a moral justification based on math for the nuclear bomb drops, but there would have been a lot more people murdered if we didn't drop the bombs. Now you could say, well, you didn't have to firebomb me either, but get real.
Yeah.
We were not going to have our guys go on to shore into mainland uh, Japan without bombing them first. And there was going to be so many incendiary bombs and
Mm.
other bombs going to be dropped on that island. They'd be lucky if they had anybody alive at the end of that.
Yeah. That is true. That is good points. Good points all around. It then moves on to discuss lions and foxes and political ethics. How should this ruler behave? Interestingly, he says that the ruler must be like a fox to recognize traps and like a lion to frighten away wolves. However, we cannot always be on tops of events, and so therefore caution is better than rashness. We must always avoid flatterers as well. Be cautious of the advice we're listening to, be cautious of the events around us, be prepared for everything, essentially. It says the prince ends on the role of fortune in human affairs. It's a common view that the affairs of the world are so much ruled by fortune and God that the ability of men cannot control them. Machiavelli suggests that fortune is any force that we are commonly bad at controlling, so we must work to have safeguards like dams for flooding. He says we cannot control the flood, we cannot control when the river floods, but we can have these dams in place when it does inevitably flood that will help, maintain the flooding and things like that. It says at other times, fortune is represented as a real force for good or evil, and therefore we must adapt our temperaments to suit the environment to rule by fortune. He then ends, I'm going to read from the book here. Machiavelli never suggested that he held distinctively unchristian views. On the other hand, he never said anything to suggest deep piety. Since he cared a great deal about his literary skills, it might have been no more than decoration to make a point of some seriousness. On the other hand, it may have been something deeper than lip service to the idea that fate is an active force in the world, bringing us to good and evil on a whim. So kind of this idea of balancing back and forth is chance just, random events that we cannot control, any force that is beyond our ability to control, or is chance really an agent of fate? Are these things destined to happen? Is that an unchristian view to have? How can we be prepared for whatever our fate or whatever our fortune is? And his answer is just be prepared for anything. Make sure you have safeguards in place for anything you do, which I think is fairly solid advice, no matter what field of work you're looking at. Really,
just keep working.
Yes, exactly.
Get prepared.
Exactly.
He's really a predecessor to the Boy Scouts. Be prepared.
Yes, true. Yeah, Machiavelli inspired the Boy Scouts. I think that's the lesson we're learning from this. Is they were founded on Machiavellian ethics, actually.
That is right.
We then move on to the last section in this chapter, from the Prince to the Discourses. So getting into the other major work of Machiavelli, the Discourses on Life. Says the theme of Italy recovering its Roman glory unites the prince and the discourses. So it's this idea of, how do we restore Italy to this Roman glory? That is the big question throughout both of these works. It says the Discourses is split into 3 books. The first discusses the principles underlying creation and sustaining of a successful republic. The second focuses on the expansion of Rome, and the third on the importance of great leaders. He first says that we are different from Rome. Our republics aren't principalities. Our focus is the creation of self-sustaining constitutional orders. The model here is Polybius. Rome violates the maxim that the state should keep the stable structure, as Rome started as a kingship, had kings, and then had a lot of constitutional upheavals when throwing out their kings. So Machiavelli claimed to use historical evidence of Rome properly, and the idea that human nature is the same at all times and places, and we should try to imitate the great men of history. So how can we learn from Rome in overturning from a king to a constitutional republic? What are the steps that we take to restore us to this Rome-like past, essentially?
And the author seems a little bit critical of this idea that we can learn from the past and guide our future, because there's so many changes have been made in society and in the economy and all that. But I, of course, I'm a firm believer in Thucydides, that the nature of men, the moral or the character nature of men or women, is the same over time. That we really haven't changed who we are as a people.
Yeah.
Psychologically and morally, even though the times change and the means change. I'm definitely on Machiavelli's side on this. What has happened in the past, you can look to that to try to learn how to deal effectively with the present, even though the conditions are somewhat different. You're still dealing with humans, and how they're going to react, and their motivations and their interests writ large. Each of us are individuals, but as a society, there's some themes that you can really learn from.
Yeah, very true. And the Discourses comments on Livy's history of Rome. That's really his main book that he's looking at in discussing Rome here. His main historical judgment is that success breeds failure. For Rome, in the end, was corrupted by wealth. It was essentially brought down by its own success. So throughout the discourses, he offers prudential maxims illustrated and defended by appeal to historical events. And one of these is to claim that the institution of tyranny is indefensible. One must do whatever it takes to create a political society, but in the end, that the tyrant is the enemy of his people and is rightly killed. So you can kind of have a temporary tyrant to create a better system, but if you keep this tyrant around, he's going to get killed. The people aren't going to like that. He's going to be overthrown and cast out.
Yeah, and he goes a little bit further. It's his view that you have to have an autocrat or almost a tyrant really to create a state.
Yeah.
And then once you have the state established some sort of stability, then you kill him, you get rid of him, and you establish the republic, I guess, which I think is kind of odd way to do it. And I don't, of course, he's writing before the United States was formed. I think it may have been true at his time, but the United States was not created by a tyrant. Is created by a group of people. Now you could say, well, maybe because the king was in charge first, and they kind of rebelled, and then because of that tyrant, they were able to create a republic. And so maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's what the response would be. Well, there was a tyrant there, and you overthrew him, and you created a republic because the tyrant was able to establish the order.
But he seems to indicate that like a tyrant has to be the one writing the Constitution. Like it seems like he would look at the American Revolution and say, okay, George Washington needs to make himself king first and then write a constitution and then, kind of, pass on power from there, after he dies or whatever it may be. But he seems to claim that it has to be a tyrant, has to be this, single man in charge, or single, select group of people in a way.
And there were people at that time that would agree with that philosophy. They wanted to make George Washington a king. Or a king-like figure, head of ceremony, head of state at least, and he declined. And he was, I really admire him. I think he is the first. Of course, he is the first among the presidents because he was the first. But he was so much better than the rest, just because it was so rare for somebody to have. He could have become king even after he was elected.
I think he's one of the few moral politicians as far as it goes in U.S. history. Because I can't think of a single politician today that, if given that opportunity, people saying, "Hey, we want to make you king," I can't think of a single politician that would say no. I think and if there are any that would say no, it would be a very, very short list.
It would be a short list. I would think that Rand Paul probably would.
Maybe he is consistent. He is consistent in his values. I'll give him that.
And I've come to respect him a lot more in recent years because he was very critical of our foreign wars and our Patriot Act and all that stuff. And now as the years go by, I used to think he was a goofball.
Yeah, well, he's been proven right so often.
Every time, man, it's crazy. And especially recently, it's like that they're saying, a conspiracy theory today is in 6 months is just the truth. But years and years he's been talking about issues that are pretty important issues, and he was on the opposite side of me, and now I'm like shoulder to shoulder with him. I could see somebody like him. I think there are people that would blush from it because they wouldn't want the risk associated with it. I'm starting to get a little more optimistic now. We're in the later parts of this podcast. I'm starting to think maybe better about our corrupt politicians, but I think there's a decent number of them that would refuse to be the king because the kings get murdered. They say it's great to be the king, but like Machiavelli describes, it's an all-encompassing job and it's dangerous. If you're the king, it becomes and also, I think perhaps the corruption of our politicians is only outdone by their laziness and their graft, and so they're not having to actually work at all. I think the corruption is what do they call it? Dissolute. I think they're just corrupt morally and financially and probably sexually. I think there's really bad people, but there's a select few that are really pushing for power that are elected officials. I just think they're immoral and they'll just do anything to maintain that position. But there's not many of them, I think, that are really trying to round us up and put into camps. I don't think those people have gotten elected yet, or many of them have not been elected yet, but they're coming.
Well, that's uplifting. Back to Machiavelli. He does go on to say, like we were just talking about, that there must be a founding moment where the new order is laid down, and he places a lot of emphasis on the ordini, or the laws that define the constitutional order. So you have to have these consistent ordini, these consistent laws that essentially create this whole order. He says that the beginnings are different from the sustainings. The improvised actions of the founder hero must be succeeded by regular lawful election of leaders. So this first guy can kind of do whatever is necessary, but after that, in order to keep this thing running, it has to be a lawful election. It has to keep moving regularly. He then goes on to say that religion is discussed in its importance as a social cement. He says Christianity is actually ill-suited for such purposes, because Christianity is otherworldly and it takes people's minds off of political and military duties. He also says that the corrupt religious institution of the papacy at the time sickens all of what passes for religion, and its ineffectiveness as a political institution is a detriment to its subjects. So Christianity, bad all around, and that is what got his books placed on the index of forbidden books. Of course, say anything bad about Christianity at the time, it's going to go in the box of locked books.
You had to get permission. You had to get special permission to read the book, and only if you promised that you were just reading it to refute it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I really gonna refute it, and I can let me read it. No, I don't believe you.
He says that a certain amount of uproar in a republic is conducive to liberty. The people must stand up for their own political rights. He also says continued class conflict between the upper and lower classes made Rome powerful and free. So, I mean, I agree with that first part there, that a lot of it is eventually on the people. You cannot just expect the government to do what is in your best interests. If they start, coming after you, it is your duty, it is your right to stand up against them and protect your liberties. I don't know if, continued class warfare is essentially necessary for a state to exist. He might lose me on that one, but I mean, practically speaking, I guess it does keep things. I don't really know what his reasoning is there on that one.
He didn't say class warfare. He said class conflict.
Class conflict. Sorry. Yes.
Which is not. I mean, class warfare is warfare. So then it's a kind of a failed state.
Yes.
So I think I like this idea, and I tend to agree with it. That there's a need for a little bit of chaos, of change, to keep everything fresh and moving forward. So I do believe that even in your own life, if you're stagnant, then you're going to almost like the gravitational pull will pull you into misery. You need to have constant change and constant movement. It's like it's either growth or death. You're either growing or you're dying. Or as in Shawshank Redemption, you're either get going living or get going dying. Or how's it say?
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And so I think that's fascinating, and that you need that struggle in order to maintain a republic, because if you don't have that conflict, not a war, but a conflict between the haves and have-nots, then either the have-nots are going to overtake the haves, and you have kind of anarchy, and or the haves are just subjugating the poor, and that's no good either. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. And it's an interesting way of looking at the Roman Republic, because I've always thought of that as one of the big problems, is that they had all these class conflicts, and that I guess it forced them to deal with the competing interests. So I think it's a neat way of looking at it.
That is true. I did not think about it that way. He also defends popular republics over aristocratic republics. Says that republics are endangered by gentlemen, and he defines gentlemen as people who are rich men with the vices of feudal landowners. So essentially these people who just sit on money, they're a threat to peace because they can raise private armies and subvert the state. They have so much power, they have so many people beneath them that they can easily rise up in their own interests.
This is where I wanted to talk about earlier, that he describes the Roman Republic as an expansive republic, and he admired it for that reason. And if it's expanding, it's growing and it's changing, and it's like I said, it's not dying, it's growing, and there's opportunities that go along with that. There's a sustained effort at an expansion that can galvanize a republic or a country,
Hmm.
and I think it's an important thing.
That is true. That is a good point. It's a good point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is true. That is
And
true.
then he talks about his third one, that it cannot endure indefinitely,
Mhm.
and the half measures lead to ruin, and that it's going to deteriorate over time. And I think that's true as well, unless it's expanding. So if it's expanding, it's not going to deteriorate. If you're
Yeah.
growing and you're getting stronger and expanding, as long as your expansion doesn't cost more than what's worth for
Yeah.
the expansion and the conquest, you're not gonna just deteriorate over time. And that's a kind of a similar way of looking at the conflict between the haves and have-nots, or upper class and lower class. You have this continuous change and renewal
Hmm. Hmm.
almost, through these conflicts, and dealing with these issues as you go forward. And I don't think a republic over a long period of time can survive as the static enterprise. I'm coming to that conclusion that you have to be able to expand and grow.
Hmm.
If it's just static, because like he talks about, like the aristocrats will just try to aggregate wealth to themselves and
Yeah.
not even care about the republic anymore, and the people will vote to give themselves stuff,
Mhm.
which is
Yes.
always the criticism of democracies, but it's also true of republics.
Mhm.
They have input through their representatives,
Huh.
and so if you don't have this expansion, then the people will just kind of, it will decay. But if you're able to expand and do new things, and bring more people in,
Hmm.
to the country, through that colonialization and that expansion, or however you want to talk about it, you can keep the republic going,
Yeah.
and then you're bringing them in. Like, so, like, if I'm not saying that this is a good idea, but well, the last state to be brought in the Union was Hawaii, and that was 1959. Before that, it wasn't too long before that. I think it was Arizona before that, if I think.
Well,
No,
Alaska.
Alaska.
Yeah.
Alaska was Alaska last. No,
Uh,
it
it was
was
Hawaii. Hawaii, and then before that was
Alaska,
Alaska.
and then I think Arizona might have been the one before that,
I I,
which was
I don't know before that.
1912, I think. So if you look at when we stopped admitting new states, I mean, those two, of course, they are not contiguous. The last contiguous, which I think was in 1912,
Hmm.
admitted the United States as a state. I think you can see kind of a decline
Yeah.
after that. And so, like say if we expanded into Canada, we took Ontario or something, and then made that a state. Well, then now hey, I can go to the 51st state, Ontario. I can go to Quebec or whatever, and then they're American, and then we could expand, or we could expand south, which would have its own issues. And I'm not saying that we should do that necessarily, but um, and then you say, well, when does it stop? Well, it stops when we have the entire world as a republic. I mean, I'm not kidding. I mean,
Yeah.
what other system of government would work on a worldwide scale other than a constitutional republic with
Mhm.
essentially local control, with member states that had their own discretion to administer themselves, but there would be a common federal government over everybody, a limited federal government that would primarily responsible for ensuring individual rights within each of the member states. I mean,
Huh.
isn't that what a world government should be?
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
I mean,
and so
that's true.
really, so really, what we should be saying is that the United States obligation to the world is to conquer the world, and eventually make them all member states within the United States of America, where the federal government of the United States would ensure individual liberty for each of the individuals in every member state.
Hmm.
And we wouldn't be going to war. Once we conquer the entire world, we would all be us.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, that's what the end result, the only possible good end result for our world would be a republic, that is modeled after the United States, but more effectively run than we are. I mean, there would be all sorts of logistical problems, um, but that's really, what else could we have?
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Going back to what you were saying about like having a common goal, um, I mean, I've said this before on the podcast, but it's kind of the idea of like that's where I think a lot of our problems today stem from is that people don't have anything better to do. It's like we're getting angry at everything. We're saying, this is evil and this is awful because we don't know what evil and awful is. We have no common purpose. We have no common goal. We haven't seen anything bad happen, so we're making up bad things. And now we're arguing about these made up bad things when, we should be doing better things. And it's like, well, we've done this because there's nothing better to do. We're making up problems. And I think once we do have an actual, problem that faces America as a whole, then I think a lot of those smaller problems will just disappear because nobody will care anymore because they weren't real problems in the first place.
You'd hope so. It's like it's a common theme in the last few years. What is it? Hard times make strong men.
Mm-hmm.
Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men. Weak men create bad times. And it's kind of a cyclical thing. If you lose sight of the fact that you have to maintain an effective society and a republic, or else everything goes to the crapper. Then if you forget that, then everything's going to go to the crapper. I think you're right. I think there's a lot of trivial issues that are taking the forefront today. And well, really, I guess really what's going to the most likely catastrophic event that will, in theory, unite us will be the fiscal collapse of all financial institutions across the world. That will be jarring. But $31 trillion in debt in the United States alone. If our interest rates go up too much further, we're talking about debt service that's going to exceed any other spending item in the federal budget. And so all those entitlements and all that discretionary spending is going to be vaporized by us just having to pay off the debt. And if there's a complete collapse of the financial markets, which is possible, what happens then? But we may not enjoy that. I mean, because after the stock market crash in the 1920s, I mean, in that era we had legitimate risk of a communist takeover of the United States. I mean, there was organized communist parties, and were popular at the time, socialists and communists and all that, in the teens, 20s, and 30s.
Interesting.
But anyway, so that was probably the biggest threat to the republic was at that time.
Interesting.
And so it's either going to be a common cause or we'll be at each other's throats.
Uplifting. I want to return back to Machiavelli for like one more passage from the book. Going off what you were saying about how these big powers are sort of destined to die eventually, if they're stagnant and things like that. He ends the chapter by saying that readers' reactions to Machiavelli depend heavily on their reactions to such banal but important truths about human existence. It is clear that Machiavelli thought that life was for the living and that death was its inevitable companion, by the same token that the world of politics had its own raison d'être, which only the faint-hearted or slow-footed would fail to be moved by. Those who were neither faint-hearted nor slow-footed, but who marched to a different drummer, could always retire to a monastery and contemplate eternal verities. It does not seem that Machiavelli would have condemned them for so doing, but he had nothing to say for them. It's kind of going back to the idea, a lot of his advice is practical. It's how do we impact politics? What is the actual state of human existence? How are people really, not like how they should be? And that's sort of the underlying theme behind all of his works. And then sort of that is, what is the most practical way to run a state and things like that. And that is where we get all of these lovely ends justify the means, very uplifting messages from Machiavelli.
And you slightly misquoted the author.
Did I?
When he talks about the people who can go to, he would not condemn those people that go to a monastery.
Yes.
But he had nothing to say to them.
Yes.
Not for them.
But did I say for them?
For, but to them. Because he didn't have anything to say to any of them. There was nothing that would interest them, and he had no interest in talking to somebody that wanted to be in a monastery. He was just talking about, okay, how do you become a ruler and how do you stay a ruler, and all that moralizing was irrelevant to him. And it's an interesting discussion, and I think it's something that all political consultants believe now. But I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to convince myself to be more optimistic, but yeah, I mean, he certainly is right in the sense that that is how you get power. That's how you keep power. Um, but um, but it's also how you can't maintain power, because if you are deceitful and you're always scheming, your enemies or your rivals, maybe not enemies, anybody near you knows that you're a danger.
Yeah.
And so you're setting yourself up for assassination,
Hmm.
because you cannot be dealt with, like that guy who killed his the Borgia guy. They killed his enforcer
Hmm.
and had him dismembered. Well, his next enforcer, if he had a next enforcer, which he I understand he didn't, but if he had another enforcer, that enforcer's he's going to be thinking two things: one, I got to subjugate these people, and two, I got to kill that guy.
Yeah.
Because he's going to kill me after I get my job done. I got to make sure that I can take over him,
Hmm.
because because once you betray people, if there's no trust, that's a problem.
Hmm.
A problem for you, and then you're always scheming, and then you're living in fear. And
Yeah.
so I think what he's saying is true to a point, but there are limitations to it, because if especially in a republic, if you have people that are voting, choosing their leaders, and you're just always, I really think I'm starting to come down, like one of these election results that just came out recently. I'm starting to become convinced that it wasn't necessarily the draw of Trump back in 16. I think just everybody agreed that Clinton was just such a crook. We couldn't have the Clintons come back.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, there's some truth. A lot of people love Trump,
Hmm.
but uh, she was just a uniquely horrible candidate,
Yeah.
and she couldn't be trusted by anybody. And like those Epstein jokes, and about people say criticize Hillary Clinton, and then they'll immediately say I am not suicidal, because alleging that she would have him killed, but it kind of rings true. And so that's an example of somebody who's been untrustworthy and duplicitous, that the Clintons. And once you get to that point, it's like, okay, you're going to lose power doing these things too. You can't maintain power if you're just duplicitous to everybody. And I
Yeah.
think you have to have some sort of honor among thieves.
Mhm.
But I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think he's right about a lot of things. Like, I mean, especially when he's talking about, like the half measures and everything. You either have to caress or crush. And I think that's very true. Like when I was reading that, I was thinking about like basically every European powers or Western powers, attempt to influence the Middle East. Because I feel like every one of them has done it in kind of a half measure way. Like we like the U.S. We made ourselves very much known. We fought battles and we tried to build infrastructure and we tried to influence things very clearly and very publicly. But we didn't try to dismantle all the institutions, and we didn't necessarily try to act through them either. In a way that it was, and I think Machiavelli would have saw that, well, yeah, that was doomed to fail. You're going to be kicked out of this country eventually because you haven't done enough to get the people to actually like you here or to actually fear you here. So I think he's spot on. I think he's predicted a lot of modern day political events. I think he's still relevant today, just in his analyses of just how politics itself works, and these really awful decisions you have to make in keeping power and maintaining a status quo.
Yeah, and using the Middle East as an example, the British were able to subjugate them. I mean, they colonized them
Yeah.
essentially, and Palestine was divided up. Jordan was Transjordan. I mean, it was just arbitrary lines in a map.
Hmm.
Iraq, Kuwait. Kuwait
Yeah.
was just arbitrary designation by the British
Yeah.
Empire, and I mean they conquered.
Hmm.
And I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that would be the difference. And I think that was the mistake. I mean, if we're going to be invading some country, especially if it's a resource rich country, we just need to conquer it. I mean, why would we invade? And we're saying, well, we're going to liberate them. Who's asking for that?
Hmm.
Nobody's asking
Well, I
for
mean,
them to
that's the problem. You didn't convince them that they needed liberation. And I'm not saying that you should do that, but it's like that's the problem that we faced over there. They weren't actually asking, or a lot of people, at least a powerful selection of people, weren't asking for democracy. They weren't asking for a republic institution of government. That this is not what
yeah,
they wanted, and they knew that, and they kicked us out.
they had no concept of it.
Mm-hmm.
When we conquered Japan, going back to that discussion, we had a military dictatorship in place essentially.
Yeah.
We had generals that were in charge, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, it developed into a constitutional republic in Japan. But that was that they were conquered, and we didn't have elections the next week.
Yeah.
There were no purple stained fingers there like they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hey, we're going to have this this orderly democracy. You can't just superimpose that on a very traditional society where nobody in the country had ever lived
Mm-hmm.
with any concept of individual human rights.
Yeah.
None of them had any concept of it. And you're right. Machiavelli would be
Mm-hmm. Well, that was his whole point. It's the creatures of habit. You have to do things slowly. You have to have a transitionary phase. You can't just say, okay, here's this new system. We're great for doing this. You must love us for doing this. And so, now we've liberated you. And of course, that didn't happen.
Right. They're almost resentful for the weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you rulers acting like such weak, ninnies? Why aren't you asserting your control over these people? And now the there's crime is rampant. Because we didn't have enough soldiers there to police the place.
Mm-hmm.
So we weren't really governing them.
Yeah.
Or well, here you guys choose your leaders. What? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? You guys are the ones in charge. You're supposed to be murdering the thieves or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, good example. I agree with that.
Yes. I mean, of course, it was an enjoyable read, as always. I like
Yes.
reading these chapters, taking notes on them. But next time,
I got to read a translation of Machiavelli's The Prince and His Discourses. That's gonna be a mem.
I think you've been saying that for a while. I think I've heard you talk about that before.
When we talked about having that as a podcast.
That is true. That is true. Yeah. That is true. Well, in the next episode, we will be going into book 2, Hobbes to the Present. Of course, starting with Thomas Hobbes himself. So we'll be getting into the more modern era. So it should be fun going forward. Yes,
be a regular party.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to add? Any other things you want to throw out here? Any other opinions, thoughts, anything?
No.
All right. Well, this has been season 4, episode 12 of Unlimited Opinions. You can always follow us on Twitter to get updates on when our next episodes are live at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. That's ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
This has been Unlimited Opinions.
I haven't seen any tweets lately. Are you tweeting still?
Oh, I'm tweeting. Yes, I tweet every week.
I wonder if I'm still following you. I don't know.
You unfollowed the podcast Twitter.
I don't know if I have. I haven't seen any tweets.
Because we don't have a blue check mark.
Oh, I'm not paying $8 for that. I'm already paying for the podcast.
That is true.
All right. Good times.
Good times.